We're cutting your salary in half. Take it or leave it. My name is Mac Henderson, and I'm staring at Brett Morse as he slides this paper across his desk, like he's doing me some kind of favor. The measuring tape on my belt clicks against the metal chair when I lean forward. 20 years I've been with Morse Construction, and this 35-year-old kid thinks he's about to teach me a lesson about my place in the world. The number on that paper wouldn't cover my son's spring tuition at engineering school. I look up at Brett, and he's got this smirk, same one his old man used to get when he thought he was being clever. Only difference is his father actually knew which end of a hammer to hold. Take it or leave it, he says again, leaning back in that leather chair like he just solved some complex structural problem. 20 years of 6 a.m. job site meetings. 20 years of weekend permit runs and city inspector hand-holding. 20 years of keeping contractors happy and municipal projects on schedule while Brett was learning business theory up at Northwestern. And this is what he thinks my load-bearing capacity is worth. I tap my measuring tape against my thigh twice. I understand. I tell him, folding the paper neat and square. When does this take effect? His smirk gets wider. Immediately. I nod. Perfect timing. Something shifts in his expression because that wasn't the reaction he was expecting from a guy who needs to keep his mortgage current and his boy in school. See? What Brett didn't know as he sat there trying to show me my structural limits was that 3 weeks earlier, I'd gotten a call from Tony Castellano. Tony runs Castellano Construction, the most successful operation in our county, been watching our projects for years. Not Brett's PowerPoint presentations, but the actual concrete getting poured, and the permits getting approved on schedule. Mac, Tony had said when we met for coffee at the job site trailer, I need someone who understands that construction is built on handshakes, not just contracts. I'm expanding into municipal work, and I need a partner who knows how to keep city engineers happy and inspectors cooperative. I hadn't given him an answer that day, told him I needed time to think it over. But sitting there watching Brett destroy 20 years of loyalty with a salary cut that would make my ex-wife laugh, Tony's offer suddenly felt like load calculations finally balancing out. You have to understand something about Brett Morse. He inherited this company from his father 18 months ago, never spent a day coordinating subcontractors, never had to sweet-talk a building inspector when the foundation pour didn't go according to plan, never had to explain to a homeowner why their basement needs another week to cure properly. He's one of those guys who thinks showing up with an MBA automatically makes him qualified to run field operations. What he never realized is that for the past 5 years, I've been the structural support holding his entire business together. Not officially, of course. On paper, I'm senior project manager, but practically every major decision flows through my relationships first. Every crisis gets handled by me before it reaches his climate-controlled office. Every municipal contract exists because I built those connections one inspection at a time, one successful project at a time. Take our biggest job, the new courthouse project. When Jimmy Rodriguez from City Planning needs to discuss scheduling conflicts, he calls me directly. When we need expedited permits, Sarah Walsh in the permits office recognizes my voice on the first ring. When there's a problem with concrete delivery or electrical inspection timing, I call Rodriguez Brothers and they rearrange their entire schedule because we've worked together for 15 years and they know I'm good for it. Or consider the Riverside subdivision our second biggest project running right now. I've been their point man for 3 years. I know which city councilman lives on Elm Street. I remember when Fire Chief Kowalski's daughter got married and we donated materials for the church renovation project. I send congratulations when their quarterly safety inspections come back clean. Brett shows up to the ribbon-cutting ceremonies and makes small talk with the mayor. But when there's a real problem with utilities or drainage, Rodriguez calls me because he knows I'll have solutions, not excuses. This pattern repeats across our entire project list. 12 major jobs, and every single relationship runs through my connections on the ground. Not because I'm some master politician playing angles, but because I actually show up when things go wrong. I remember details that matter. I follow through on what I promise. I deliver quality work that passes city inspection the first time, every time. But here's what really made Brett vulnerable, what he never saw coming from his corner office with the nice view. The suppliers and subcontractors who keep his business running work primarily through me, not him. When we need emergency concrete delivery on a Saturday because the weather window is closing, I call Rodriguez Brothers directly and they make it happen. When our electrical subcontractor hits a snag with the city inspector over code interpretations, I know which sections to reference and which inspector to call for clarification. When the city engineers want to discuss load specifications or foundation requirements, they ask for me by name because they know I'll have the structural drawings ready and the calculations double-checked. These aren't just business relationships built on competitive bidding and lowest prices. They're professional connections built over years of consistent, reliable work and mutual respect. While Brett was playing golf with other MBA graduates and attending Chamber of Commerce dinners where he'd hand out business cards to people who'd forget him within a week, I was building a foundation of genuine professional trust based on competence and follow-through. Even his employees come to me when there's a real problem that needs solving. When someone's confused about building codes or permit requirements, they walk over to my desk. When there's a conflict between the electrical and plumbing subs about who's responsible for what, they ask if I can mediate before it turns into a job-stopping argument. When people are thinking about finding other work because they're frustrated with how things are being run, they mention it to me first. Not because I position myself as some alternative authority figure undermining Brett's management, but because I actually solve problems instead of just delegating them up the chain or scheduling meetings to discuss scheduling more meetings. The week after my conversation with Tony, I started paying closer attention to exactly how much of Brett's business depended on my personal relationships and institutional knowledge. It was like checking the structural integrity of a building and discovering that one support beam was holding up the entire framework. I was copied on probably 95% of important communications with contractors and city officials. My phone number was the one most suppliers had saved in their contacts. My relationships were the ones that generated repeat municipal contracts and referrals from satisfied clients. I realized that Brett had made a classic mistake that a lot of second-generation business owners make. He'd built his management style around being the visible owner while I functioned as the actual load-bearing structure. Remove me from the equation and everything else would have nothing solid to stand on. So when he slid that salary cut across his desk with such obvious satisfaction, when he looked at me like I was some replaceable piece of equipment that should be grateful for whatever maintenance budget he threw my way, I knew exactly what my specifications were worth in the current market. Perfect timing, I'd said, and I meant every word. I stood up from his office that Thursday afternoon and walked directly out to my truck. I opened my phone and typed out a brief text to Tony Castellano. I accept your partnership offer. When do we start laying foundation? His response came back within 30 minutes, Monday morning. Welcome to Castellano Construction, partner. It was Thursday afternoon. That same day, I walked back into the office and submitted my formal resignation to Rita Martinez, our office manager who'd been keeping that place running since before Brett learned to drive. 2 weeks' notice as required by my employment contract. Professional, courteous, giving Brett adequate time to transfer my responsibilities to someone else. Of course, what Brett didn't understand was that my responsibilities couldn't actually be transferred to another person. You can't hand over 20 years of relationship building in a 2-week transition period, no matter how detailed your documentation. When I told Brett I was leaving, he barely looked up from his computer screen where he was probably updating some spreadsheet that had nothing to do with actual job performance. Fine, he said, waving his hand like he was shooing away a fly. We'll manage the structural load without you. I almost laughed out loud. Instead, I spent my remaining 2 weeks being the most helpful departing employee in construction history. I documented every project I was managing with detailed timeline charts and contact information. I created comprehensive contractor profiles with job histories, billing preferences, and notes about their specific operational requirements. I wrote step-by-step guides for handling city permit processes, including which inspectors preferred morning appointments and which ones needed extra documentation for unusual situations. I organized my project files systematically and left clear instructions for whoever would be taking over my various responsibilities. What I didn't do, what I couldn't do, was transfer the actual relationships themselves, because you can't transfer trust that's been built over years of consistent performance. You can't document the fact that Jimmy Rodriguez fast-tracks my permit applications because I've never submitted incomplete paperwork or asked for special favors I hadn't earned. You can't write a manual explaining that Sarah Walsh calls me personally when there's going to be a problem with an inspection because she knows I'll handle it professionally instead of throwing a tantrum or trying to blame someone else. You can't hand over the respect I've earned from subcontractors who know that when I give them a completion timeline, the materials will be there when I promised, and the previous trades will have their work finished on schedule. On my last day, I cleaned out my desk while Brett was in some meeting with his accountant, probably trying to figure out how my departure would affect his quarterly projections. I took my personal items, my level, my hard hat, some photos of completed projects I was particularly proud of, and I left behind all the company property, all the project files, all the permit documentation. I wasn't stealing anything that belonged to Morse Construction. I was just no longer available to be the invisible infrastructure holding everything together. I shook hands with my coworkers, especially the guys who'd been there long enough to remember when Brett's father was still running day-to-day operations. I hugged Rita, who'd been keeping that office organized and functional since before Brett could spell construction. And I drove my truck out of that parking lot at exactly 500 on Friday afternoon, measuring tape clicking against my belt, one last time as I walked away from 20 years of unappreciated competence. Monday morning, I started my new position as Tony's partner at Castellano Construction. We'd structured the partnership agreement so I'd have equity ownership and decision-making authority from day one. Not just another employee title with extra responsibilities. My new office was in a double-wide trailer at the main equipment yard, with windows that looked out over actual machinery and material stockpiles instead of decorative landscaping designed to impress visitors who never got their boots dirty. By Tuesday, my old work phone number had been disconnected and forwarded to a generic voicemail system that nobody checked with any regularity. By Wednesday afternoon, things at Brett's company started getting interesting in ways he hadn't anticipated. Jimmy Rodriguez called the main office looking for me about a foundation inspection that needed to be rescheduled due to weather delays. The receptionist transferred him to Brett, who had no idea what project Jimmy was referring to, why the timing mattered, or what the inspection was supposed to cover. Jimmy hung up confused and called the county engineering department to ask if anyone knew what was happening with Morse Construction's scheduling coordination. Rodriguez brothers called Thursday morning with a question about concrete specifications for the courthouse expansion project. Brett took the call personally, trying to sound knowledgeable about structural requirements, but it became obvious within 10 minutes that he didn't understand the engineering specs his own company had submitted in their original bid. Rodriguez asked to speak with someone who was actually familiar with the technical details and load calculations. There wasn't anyone available who could answer those questions. By Friday of that first week, 4 more contractors had called with various questions and received similarly unhelpful responses. 2 suppliers called about delivery schedules that I would normally have coordinated based on project timelines and weather forecasts. The building inspector showed up for a scheduled foundation inspection that Brett had completely forgotten was happening, which resulted in a failed inspection and a 2-week delay while they scrambled to reschedule. I know all this because people started calling me directly. Not to complain about Brett exactly, but to ask if I knew what was happening over there and whether there was some kind of transition period they should be aware of. Jimmy Rodriguez tracked down my new number through the permits office and called to congratulate me on my partnership with Tony. "Mac, I don't know what's going on at your old place," he said, "but it's like they forgot how to coordinate projects. Nobody there seems to know what's happening with their own jobs anymore." I listened sympathetically but didn't offer any explanations or insights about internal operations. What was I supposed to say? That Brett had spent 18 months taking credit for work he couldn't actually perform himself. The second week was when the real structural problems started showing. One of their biggest suppliers, the concrete company I'd worked with for 12 years, called about an overdue payment that was affecting their cash flow. Brett apparently got defensive about their payment terms and suggested they should be more patient about money since they'd been doing business together for so long. The owner called me that afternoon. "Mac, I don't know what's happening over there, but that's not how we're used to handling business relationships. If this is how they want to operate going forward, we might need to reconsider our credit terms and delivery priorities." I maintain my professional boundaries completely. That sounds like a conversation you should have directly with them about your business policies. But of course, I also mentioned that my new company was looking for reliable concrete suppliers. And would he be interested in discussing potential partnership arrangements with Castellano Construction? This is where people sometimes misunderstand what happened next. I didn't sabotage Brett's business operations. I didn't steal his contractors or spread negative information about his company. I simply started building relationships in my new role the same way I'd always built relationships throughout my career, by being competent, reliable, and genuinely helpful to the people I worked with. When Jimmy Rodriguez mentioned he was getting frustrated with the lack of communication and coordination from Morse Construction, I listened. When he asked if Castellano Construction might be interested in submitting a proposal for the courthouse expansion phase, I said we'd be happy to have that conversation. When Rodriguez brothers mentioned they were having cash flow issues with late payments from their biggest client and needed to find more reliable business partners, I was honest about what we could offer in terms of payment terms and project scheduling. Within 3 weeks of leaving Brett's company, Tony and I had secured meetings with 6 different contractors who were getting increasingly frustrated with the service levels they were receiving from their current general contractor. Not because I actively recruited them away from existing relationships, but because they sought us out after their phone calls weren't getting returned promptly and their operational problems weren't getting resolved efficiently. The beautiful thing about building genuine professional relationships over many years is that people remember competence and reliability when they need it most. When they're getting poor service and communication from one contractor, they naturally think about someone who consistently delivered quality coordination and problem solving. It's not corporate espionage or unethical competitive behavior, it's just basic professional reputation and market forces working the way they're supposed to. By the end of my first month at Castellano Construction, we'd signed partnership agreements with 4 new subcontractors. All of them happened to be companies I'd worked successfully with for years. Companies that had grown frustrated with their current general contractor's inability to provide the level of coordination and communication they'd grown accustomed to receiving. The tipping point came when Rodriguez brothers made the decision to switch their primary partnership. Their owner called Brett personally to explain that they'd be moving their working relationship to a contractor who better understood their operational requirements and payment schedules. Brett apparently became aggressive and accusatory, suggesting they were being influenced by a former employee who was engaging in unethical competitive practices. Rodriguez called me that afternoon, actually laughing about the conversation. "Mac, that kid just proved exactly why we made the right decision about changing partnerships. He spent 15 minutes yelling at me about employee loyalty and competitive ethics, but he couldn't answer a single question about our actual project specifications or delivery requirements. It's like he never understood what we do or why his father's company hired us in the first place." That's when I finally understood what was really happening. Brett hadn't just lost me as an employee when I decided to leave. He'd lost the person who translated between his business school theories and the actual requirements of running construction projects successfully. Without me there to bridge that gap between his management concepts and real-world operations, contractors and suppliers were getting direct exposure to his fundamental incompetence. The story started reaching me through industry contacts and professional networks. How Brett had shown up to a job site coordination meeting without the proper architectural drawings and tried to improvise solutions based on outdated specifications. How he'd promised completion schedules that his remaining staff couldn't possibly meet because they didn't have the supplier relationships necessary to expedite material deliveries when weather caused delays. How he'd completely mishandled a foundation settling issue that I would have resolved with 3 phone calls to the right city engineers and some additional structural reinforcement. Each failure made my former contractors more appreciative of the coordination and communication they were now receiving from Tony and me. Each conversation with Brett reminded them why they'd actually valued working with Morse Construction when I was there to make everything run according to schedule and specification. 8 weeks after I left, I ran into Rita Martinez at the lumberyard on a Saturday morning. She looked exhausted and stressed in a way I'd never seen during all the years we'd worked together. "Mac, it's complete chaos over there," she said, shaking her head. "Brett keeps asking us to handle things you used to coordinate, but none of us have your relationships or know-how. Half the contractors won't return our calls anymore. The city's constantly asking where you went, and Brett just keeps insisting we need to figure it out because projects have to continue moving forward." I felt genuinely sorry for her and the other employees who were dealing with the fallout of Brett's mismanagement and poor business decisions. They were good, hardworking people caught in an impossible situation that wasn't their fault. "Are you looking for other opportunities?" I asked. "Everyone is," she said quietly. But Brett started making threats about non-compete clauses and legal action if anyone else decides to leave. He's getting desperate. That's when I knew Brett was truly panicking about his situation. Empty legal threats are what incompetent managers resort to when they realize they've lost control of circumstances they never actually understood in the first place. Tony and I started getting calls from talented people at Brett's company over the next several weeks. Not because I was actively recruiting them or badmouthing their current employer, but because word had spread through industry networks about our growing success and professional work environment. When people are trapped in a failing situation, they naturally gravitate toward opportunities that look more stable and rewarding for their careers. We hired 4 of Brett's former employees over the following month. All of them had given proper notice according to their employment contracts. All of them had been released from any legitimate contractual obligations, and all of them were eager to work somewhere their skills and experience would be valued rather than taken for granted. With each new hire, we gained deeper institutional knowledge about projects and relationships that were struggling at the old company. Not proprietary trade secrets or confidential client information, but general industry knowledge and professional expertise that these individuals had developed over years of experience in the local construction market. The final support beam collapsed when the courthouse expansion project made their decision to switch general contractors. Jimmy Rodriguez called me personally to explain the city's reasoning. "Mac, we've been trying to make it work with Morse Construction for 4 months now, but it's like working with complete strangers. Nobody there understands our requirements, our history, or our operational constraints. Every conversation starts from zero baseline. We're paying premium rates for amateur-level coordination and communication. When Tony and I signed the courthouse expansion contract, Castellano Construction became the fastest-growing construction company in the county. In 5 months, we'd gone from a solid local operation to a major player in municipal and commercial projects. All because Brett Morse thought cutting my salary in half would teach me about my structural limitations and market value. The last time I saw him was at the County Contractors Association meeting about 8 months after I'd left his company. He looked terrible, stressed, tired, defensive, like a man watching his inheritance crumble around him. When he saw me across the meeting room, he actually tried to approach me for a conversation. "Mac," he said, "we need to talk about this situation." I was polite but firm.
I don't think there's anything for us to discuss, Brett.
"You destroyed my business," he said, loud enough that other people in the room started paying attention to our conversation. I looked at him calmly, measuring my words carefully. "I didn't destroy anything, Brett. I just stopped holding it all together." That was the moment he finally understood what had really happened to his company. I could see the realization in his face. For 18 months, he'd been running a construction business where his most important function was staying out of my way while I made everything work properly. When he drove me away with his arrogance and disrespect, he lost the only person who'd been preventing his fundamental incompetence from becoming visible to contractors, suppliers, and municipal clients. He didn't lose his business because I sabotaged his operations. He lost it because he'd never actually been running it successfully in the first place. 6 months later, I heard through industry contacts that Brett had been forced to sell what remained of Morse Construction to pay outstanding debts and obligations. The company name that his father had built over 30 years disappeared entirely. The equipment went to auction. The remaining contracts were transferred to other local contractors at discounted rates. Today, 2 years later, Tony and I run a construction company with 28 employees and contracts extending into 4 counties. We have a project waiting list that stretches 10 months out. The County Business Journal named us Contractor of the Year. The State Contractors Association asked me to speak at their annual convention about relationship-based business development. But here's what I want you to understand about this whole story. I never set out to destroy Brett Morse or his father's company. I never planned some elaborate revenge scheme or engaged in unethical competitive practices. I simply refused to continue supporting someone who treated me as disposable, while depending entirely on my work, relationships, and expertise to maintain his business reputation. The most effective form of professional revenge isn't what you do to someone who wrongs you. It's what happens when you stop doing everything for them that they never appreciated in the first place. If this story reached you, remember that your professional value isn't determined by how someone else treats you or compensates you. It's determined by what you choose to build when you finally decide you deserve better treatment and recognition. Don't let anyone convince you that your years of experience and competence are worth less than they offered you yesterday. The market will tell you what you're really worth when you have the courage to test it.